Sometimes you come across videos on YouTube and various other places, and you see things you wouldn't otherwise see. For instance, a few years ago, I noticed a video put out by Jimmy Kimmel where he had asked his audience right after Halloween to lie to their kids and tell them that they had eaten all their Halloween candy and to video their kids' reactions and send them into the show. So the whole bit was clips of children who had been told all their Halloween candy was gone. And he was just getting reactions. And yes, that's a cruel gag to play on kids. And I was appalled at first to think that all these parents got on board with this. And I still am. It just sounds cruel to me. But once you start watching something like this, you kind of notice things. And one of the things I noticed was the kids had a wide range of reactions to being told their Halloween candy was gone. And, it just got me thinking that this is a case of where you squeeze somebody and you see what comes out. Some of the kids would just fly into a tirade. They'd maybe even run at the parent and knock the phone out of their hands as they're trying to do the video. Some kids, one kid would flopped over as if he had passed out. Another kid told his mother that he never wanted to talk to her again, never wanted to see her again, and she ought to get a job. So there were a lot of aggressive responses, but there was this one kid who, his reaction was to first pout. He kind of got the big lip and pouted, but he didn't say anything. And then he said, "It's okay. It's all right." And his mother's like, "You're not mad at me?" And he's like, "No, it's okay." And she's like, "Oh, I love you. Thank you." He was just very accepting and forgiving. Some people might say that that's an overly passive response. The other kids are aggressive, but this kid was passive. But certainly he seemed to be the sweetest one of the bunch and didn't have a big problem with his candy being gone, was willing to accept the loss and continue to love the parent anyway. So when you're squeezed, when you get some kind of bad news and you're squeezed, it does reveal who you are. It does kind of show what's inside you. And as we look at Joseph today in Genesis chapter 45, and also I'll be talking about earlier parts of the story of Joseph, but our focus for today is Genesis 45, especially verse 5. And what we find is a story of someone who's been squeezed. Joseph, as a young man, was much beloved by his father. He was kind of the special child, and he did get special treatment. And his brothers resented that. Of course, we know the story of the Technicolor coat, that his father gave him a coat of many colors and spoiled him. And not only that, but Joseph didn't have the greatest relationship with his brothers, because there was one time where they were misbehaving and Joseph brought home a bad report. In essence, Joseph tattletaled on them. And they felt jealous about his favoritism that he received from the father. So one day when they saw Joseph coming, they schemed first to kill him. But then one of the brothers said, "No, let's not kill him. Let's put him in the cistern and we'll do something to him, but let's not kill him." And then the brothers got this idea that there was a passing caravan of merchants, and they lifted him out of the cistern and simply sold him to the merchants as a slave. Then they took the coat, tore it, put some animal blood on it, and came home with the tattered, blood-stained coat to tell the father that Joseph was gone. So can you imagine siblings treating each other like this? Doing something out of jealousy. Really, the jealousy gave rise to them doing something truly evil. It was not only the harm to Joseph, sending him off to a foreign land in slavery, but think of the trauma to the father to find out that his beloved son has been torn to pieces. They led him to believe torn to pieces by animals. Joseph himself faced some trauma, I'm sure. The scripture doesn't go into this very much, but if your brothers take you one day and sell you into slavery and you don't think you'll ever see anyone you've ever known before, previously again, that's got to be traumatic to be treated that way by your own flesh and blood. You might even wonder, God, where were you? How could you let this happen to me? What, were you asleep when my brothers were scheming against me and put me in that cistern? Where were you? Because Joseph does believe in God and he trusts in God, but I'm sure for a time that he had some questions and some trauma. But overall, if we look at the story of Joseph, he turns his attention to what's in front of him. He pays attention to the current moment, the current situation, and he looks for where God is giving him opportunity. And in this way, we see what happens when Joseph is squeezed. He always looks for God giving him opportunity. What about us today? When bad things happen to good people, we know it really happens. It's happened to all of us at one time or another. Either a family member or a friend, someone we trusted, betrayed us. Maybe it happens at work. A coworker goes behind our back and maybe steals a promotion that we thought we deserved, somehow connives and scratches and tugs until they get what we think we deserve. It's that sense of betrayal, being stabbed in the back. Sometimes it's our childhoods and our upbringing. We think about how our parents treated us or how they were absent, didn't give us the support we really needed. And now we have difficult relationships with our parents as elders. Maybe they're even looking to us to provide care for them, but we just feel like we were betrayed. We were let down as children, and it's hard to get over that bitterness. We might even ask God, how did you allow this to happen? How did you allow these people to do us such harm? But is it possible, like Joseph, that one day we might look back on all the hurts, all the betrayals, all the backstabbing, and say, Lord, you knew what was best. You actually turned all of this around for good and brought out good in my life and gave me opportunity to do good. Do you think that might be possible? Looking back at Joseph some more, when he got to Egypt, he was sold to Potiphar, and very quickly Potiphar saw that Joseph had great ability and excellent positivity, that he really had God's favor, in fact. And so Potiphar gave him control over the whole household. Everything in the household was under Joseph's management. And Joseph very clearly saw this was a great opportunity from God, that this was the best possible scenario for someone who had been sold into slavery. And Joseph made the most of it. So when Potiphar's wife makes advances towards him and tries to tempt him into sexual immorality, Joseph has a very immediate answer to her, which is, I will do no such thing. Joseph is living in sight of God, always aware of God's presence, always aware that he's living out a life of integrity and righteousness in God's sight. And any sin he might commit, he knows that any sin he might commit is actually a sin against God. So he ends up framed by Potiphar's wife as if he had committed this sexual assault and sent to prison. Now again, Joseph could have turned bitter. He could have really fanned the flames of hatred and schemed for vengeance. He could have spent his whole time in prison trying to figure out what he could do to harm Potiphar's wife. But no, that was the farthest thing from Joseph's mind. He turned his attention to the current situation and saw being in prison also as a new opportunity from God, a chance to do something good. And immediately the warden recognized that Joseph had God's favor and that he was a reliable employee. So everything in the prison was put under Joseph's dominion. Again, God blessed him. Even in the worst circumstances, God blessed him and brought something good out of it. Well, how about us today? When we're faced with something that could cause us to be bitter, when someone has wronged us, when we have enemies all around us, do we cave into that bitterness? Do we fan those flames of hatred? I know for sure we're challenged when Jesus says to us to love our enemies and to do good to those who harm us or betray us. That we should, if someone strikes us on the cheek, we should turn the other cheek. You know, no matter how many different ways Jesus says it, it's hard for us to comprehend how to do that. Because really deep down we think, Jesus, if you really loved me, you would avenge me. You would want bad things to happen to those people who did bad to me, just like I want bad things to happen to those people, if we're really honest. But Jesus says, no, be merciful. Not only be merciful, but be merciful because it's what the Father does. The Father does good to those who don't deserve it. Over and over again, the Father does good to those who don't deserve it. And you have the image of the Father inside you. So Jesus says, do not do harm to those who hate you. Instead, do the opposite. Do good. Well, there's plenty of us out there who have an incredibly hard time with this. And an author once wrote about a priest she knew. The author's name is Lamont. And she wrote about this priest who said, if God hates all the same people you hate, you know for sure you've created him in your image. It's so easy to do. We want God to hate the same people we hate. We need to be on guard about that. And if we fan those flames of hatred or hold on to our bitterness and resentment, it's just like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. We're doing ourselves the harm. And the other person may be completely oblivious about our emotions and our resentments. So don't drink the poison. We need to look to Joseph as our example. An author named Michael Esses said that Joseph, of all the Old Testament people, Joseph is the most Christ-like. It's kind of interesting. I mean, Joseph does accept the situation he's in, and even if it's a bad situation, he glorifies God. He always turns the other cheek. And he's always looking to do good, no matter how many people are against him. It's interesting that when Pharaoh gets word that there's a man in prison who can interpret dreams, and he calls for Joseph, and Joseph tells him, here's the meaning of your dream. There's going to be a 7-year famine, and then there's going to be, 7-year, start again. First, there's going to be 7 years of excellent crops, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And so it's vitally important that Egypt spend that 7 years of great harvest preparing for the time of famine. And so Pharaoh puts them in charge of that project, a welfare project for Egypt, storing up grain over the good 7 years so that when there's a famine, that grain can be distributed as needed. So in a way, Joseph's like Jesus in that Jesus is the bread of life, and Joseph is the bread man, the one who hands out the grain. Well, when his brothers show up looking for food during the famine, it would be a prime time for Joseph to get his revenge on them. He could do all kinds of things to them because he was the most powerful man in Egypt. If he wanted to, he could put them in prison. Oh, wait a minute. He does put them in prison for a little while. If he wanted to, he could take them into slavery. Oh, yeah, he threatens to take them into slavery. He could give them an impossible task. Yeah, he does. He sends them back home to bring Benjamin, who's the one son that their father would never want to part with. He could accuse them of being spies or thieves and have them executed even. Well, he does accuse them of being spies and thieves at a different time. So if he does these things to his brothers, if he creates all this anxiety in his brothers' lives when they don't know yet that he is Joseph, how is that Christ-like? How is that being Christ-like? Well, Jesus does repeatedly test people and squeeze them. Maybe not exactly like those parents who squeeze their kids by telling them they ate all their candy, but Jesus does create some distress in people's lives. You know, think of the rich young ruler when he tells him to sell everything he has and give away all his possessions. That's a moment of crisis. Think of the woman who touches the hem of his garment and is healed from her bleeding, and he calls out and says, "Who touched me?" Well, that was a moment of crisis for that woman because she wanted to fly under the radar. She could have gotten into trouble because she was considered unclean, but Jesus wanted her to identify herself, to step out of her comfort zone and talk with him. And you could think of the lawyer and the Jews who heard the story about the Good Samaritan. And Jesus distressed the heck out of them on that one by making the hero of the story a Samaritan. And so he challenged their racism and their hostility towards Samaritans and challenged them to be like the Samaritan in the story. So Jesus reveals someone's character by squeezing them. And in some cases, he grows people's character by distressing them, pushing them out of their comfort zone. I mean, that's how God works. He pushes us out of our comfort zone and sees what happens. And we get to see what happens as our character is challenged and as we grow. So Joseph's actions towards his brothers really ultimately are geared towards restoration. He wants to be reunited with his brothers and to reveal himself to them. But first he wants to know if they regret what they've done. And he actually does uncover that by putting them in a distressed situation. And during this time, they think he can't understand what they're saying because Joseph's using a translator. But they admit their regret over what they've done to Joseph, and they recognize that perhaps they're being punished for their wrongdoing. So they rightly recognize that they deserve punishment. So Joseph at that point breaks down and reveals himself to them that I am your brother. I am your brother. And Joseph is well because that's who I am. And if we look at Genesis 45, verse 5, he says, And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And he goes on to say, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to protect you. And he's saying there's no need for guilt. You are forgiven. And I'm not going to hold this against you ever again. He says, do not be distressed. Do not be distressed. Do not feel guilt for what you've done. And he goes on to say, because God has used this for good. God brought this about, so at this point, I could protect and help you. Now, the brothers definitely know that Joseph has forgiven them because he kisses them and he weeps with them, and they're reassured that this is genuine, that Joseph has forgiven them. And he's just being so much like God here, Joseph is, being so much like Christ. You know, God is always willing to forgive, even though it's not deserved. And by saying that God brought this about, Joseph is affirming that God works all things together for good for those who love him and those who are the called according to his purposes. You know, those are reassuring words for us today. And we need to recognize that Jesus has done good for those who don't deserve it. That would be us. Not one of us is deserving. Can any one of us say, I deserve God's forgiveness? I deserve God's grace? No, we like sheep have all gone astray. Each has gone his own way. And so it makes a weird sort of sense that Jesus tells us to love our enemies, to love those who revile and hate us, for those to help those who have hurt us. It makes a weird sense because God placed on Jesus the chastisement for all of our sins. And he willingly did that, even though we don't deserve it. We should be reassured as we spend time with Joseph that this is something we can do. We can walk with God. We can make the most of the situations we're in, recognizing that God will give us opportunities. It's reassuring to know that no matter what harm people do to us, no matter how they betray us or backstab us, all those things can be redeemed by God. Not only redeemed, but they get woven into the tapestry of our lives in such a beautiful way, in a redemptive way, and bring healing and wholeness and reunion the way Joseph is reunited with his brothers and brings his family back together despite the evil his brothers did. I just thank God that he's the kind of God that restores all things and forgives all things and brings people together. Thanks be to God. Amen.